Hi all. This week we're talking about conflict mediation. So in our last module we read about negotiation and the communication skills you need to negotiate with others. These same skills are applicable in mediation, but the big difference between negotiation and mediation is the presence of a third party. So in negotiation, the two people or parties involved in a dispute talk to each other and try to get to a solution. People take different approaches to negotiation, as we talked about for the past couple of weeks, but generally they sit across the table from each other, talk through the dispute, and work it out using communication skills and strategies we've discussed so far. So mediation happens when a third party, a separate person, is needed to help the disputants come to an agreement. So the people involved can't reach an agreement on their own, so it's necessary to bring in someone else to help. So sometimes organizations will have somebody who works as a mediator, maybe in human resources or something like this, as part of their job. Like at Ohio University, we have an ombud's office, and the person who serves as the ombud helps people address conflict. So in this way, they sort of act as a mediator. More often, though, mediation is used in things like peace talks between nations, legal disputes such as arguments between neighbors about property damage, or family disputes such as like a separation or a divorce. It's often sort of the last result. People involved in the conflict have tried other things and they can't work it out, so they end up in mediation. So mediation is a formal process, and it's fairly structured. Sometimes it's mandated by the courts. Sometimes people in a community setting will elect to use mediation rather than going to court. And court-appointed mediators are specifically trained for that job, where community mediators tend to have a wider range of training and experience, sometimes even people who are serving as volunteers to try to just be a third party and monitor the process. Many communities have local mediation centers. We have the Athens Mediation Services, and Athens Area Mediation Services, it's called, and that's common in a lot of other cities and towns, right? And sometimes those places even offer conflict mediation training to people who are interested in learning these conflict skills. So, as you see, a key part of mediation is the mediator, the person who's in the role of acting to mediate the conflict, helping the disputants come to some sort of agreement. So this is a neutral, objective, disengaged, not disengaged from the conflict, but like not someone who doesn't have a stake, right? They're not involved in the conflict. They're there as an outside person to try to help the people come to an agreement. And their job is just to sort of work with the process. Right. So a lot of what a mediator does is to try to help the people involved see conflict from other sides, other perspectives. Now, we talked about how conflict isn't just two-sided like a coin, but actually is multidimensional, has multiple sides or perspectives, right? But people in a mediation context often see conflict as two-sided, and they really only see their side. So a mediator often works people through a process to help them kind of zoom out, so to speak, to see the conflict in a larger perspective. So William Ury, whose talk we watched last week, describes this as finding the third side. So it's not one person's side and the other person's side, but it's the third side, the community perspective, the bigger perspective. He discusses this as going to the balcony to sort of look down on the conflict from a new position. Successful mediators use a lot of the communication skills we've been talking about in this class. They're very attentive to verbal and nonverbal behavior. They listen actively to help people involved share their experience. They ask good questions that are reflective and generative. They acknowledge emotions, and they help people recognize and name their emotions. They express empathy. They recognize and acknowledge conflict frames, and they work to reframe conflicts in more productive ways. So this is the core work of conflict mediation. But since mediation is a formal process, mediators also do some things that we haven't talked about as much yet in this class. So many of the mediator tasks or behaviors highlight the structured process of mediation. And mediators have to do these things because the conflict is usually pretty high stakes. So, first and foremost, the mediator must be neutral and must be fair. You cannot take a side if you are in this role. You can't have a favorite. You can't express anything that sways the process or decision toward one of the people involved and against the other, and you can't do things that would be perceived as that, even if you feel like you don't have a favorite. It's really crucial that the mediator be a neutral, impartial third party. So the mediator isn't a friend or family member who has a stake in the conflict. The mediator doesn't come up with different ideas of how to solve the conflict for disputants. The mediator isn't a judge. It's not up to the mediator to decide who's at fault and who's at blame and what the consequences should be. The mediator is a process expert whose job it is to help the disputants find an outcome that they can agree to, right? So this orientation to process drives what the mediator does. So for example, mediators really attentive to how the room is set up, where people sit, and potentially even kind of what sorts of things are in the room, like art on the wall, whatever, right? Just paying attention to the space. They want people to be relatively comfortable. They want people to be facing each other, but maybe also across a table. The mediator should be equally available to both people. Okay, so that's one thing. Another is that one of the first things the mediator does is set up ground rules to make sure that both parties agree to those ground rules before the mediation starts. These ground rules are essential, right? And you have to have them explicitly laid out and people agree to them, because otherwise you have different interpretations about what's okay and not okay to do, right? So this process of like saying these are the ground rules and making sure everybody's on board with them is really important. And mediators often use a consistent formal statement describing what's going to happen during the mediation and what their role is. Mediators also pay attention to timing, right? That's another part of the process orientation, to make sure that both people have equal and adequate time to speak. Sometimes a process is structured in such a way that, like after establishing the ground rules, the mediator meets with each person individually for the exact same amount of time and all of this to make sure that they feel safe sharing their story before the groups come together, before the people come together and engage in the conflict or talk through the conflict, right? So this can be really helpful if there are differences in power level or communication style or culture that might make it harder for one person to share their full story while in the presence of the other person. So if a mediation process involves this strategy, then they would be really clear, the mediator would be really clear to be following the ground rules, making sure that it's fair and that people have equal amount of time, right? Sometimes mediators even need to remind disputants what's at stake. Right? They can't just keep on engaging in the conflict. They have to come to a resolution. They must come to some kind of agreement. They've tried other options and didn't work. They're both here to find a solution. They're both committed to the work of mediation. If they can't get to an agreement, then things can get worse, right? And what this worse looks like really depends on what the context of the conflict is. So in community mediation, it could mean that they can't come to an agreement in mediation, so then they would need to go to court. In a court situation, it could mean the judge decides what will happen, and that could lead to less desirable outcomes like jail time, fines, etc. I mean, if it's a peace talk, then failure to come to agreement could lead to more violence and loss of life. So the mediator doesn't use this as a threat, like some sort of aggressive, you better agree or else, but difficult moments where disputants seem to be at an impasse, it's important to remind them, like, we have to get through this, right? This is something that we need to be able to work through. Or if they're fixated on some smaller issue and kind of on a tangent, the mediator can use this to sort of reframe and remind them of what's at stake. So ultimately, the goal of mediation is to help the people involved come to a place where they can have a clear outcome and they create agreements about their next steps. So our readings for this week include some examples of conflict mediation and like a reflection from someone who served as a mediator in communities, so you can kind of get a sense of what this process is like. It's possible you may find yourself in a mediation process someday, but even if not, I think it's really useful to understand how to think like a mediator. If you find yourself needing to help resolve conflicts for other people, then you'll do a better job if you're using the conflict skills that we've talked about these past few weeks, like listening, paraphrasing, asking good questions, acknowledging emotions, recognizing frames, and so on. And also being mindful and taking on some of the mediator's attention to process and fairness. So being both of those can help you really mediate conflicts between other people in a much more successful way. Okay, that's it for now. I hope these ideas are useful for you as you think through your own conflict experiences and ways that mediation might be relevant in your professional life. As always, let me know what questions you have. I look forward to engaging with your reflections this week.